Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, cosmetics. Howard Sklamberg, a former deputy commissioner at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, joins me to talk about a new law that empowers that agency to make cosmetics safer in the United States. Let's listen. Howard Sklamberg, it is great to have you back on the podcast to talk today about cosmetics and the Food and Drug Administration.
Great to be here. I look forward to it.
So there is some major legislation that passed as part of this omnibus bill that went through Congress at the end of 2022 about cosmetics. But before we talk about that legislation, I just want to ask you a basic question. What counts as a cosmetic? What is a cosmetic?
You would think that would be an easy question, but nothing in FDA regulation is easy. So I'm going to read you the actual definition, and then I'll kind of tell you what it is and what it isn't. Cosmetic is articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. So you think like, okay, well, that's stuff like makeup or cologne or perfume we think of as cosmetics, but it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to give some examples. So one thing a cosmetic is not is a drug. And so something's either a drug or a cosmetic. And what's the difference? Well, basically a drug is something you put on your body that in FDA lingo affects the structure or function. And in kind of real English, it does something other than the beautification and smell. So a couple of examples and kind of why this is complicated. A deodorant is a cosmetic because it masks odor. An antiperspirant is a drug because it is a chemical that is reducing perspiration. A regular shampoo would be a cosmetic. An anti-dandruff shampoo is a drug. And most types of makeup are cosmetics, but acne treatments would be drugs.
Howard, can I jump in for a second? What about something that's both an antiperspirant and a deodorant?
That would be a drug. But you're being a very good law school professor. Those would be exam questions that people would have to answer. But it is kind of complicated, and actually, some companies get into trouble because their labeling evolves over time, and they say things that turn it into a drug. So
we know that drugs are very tightly regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Companies have to demonstrate their safety and effectiveness generally before they can even be marketed. For things that really do fall entirely into that cosmetic category, what has been the traditional way that FDA has regulated them?
Okay, first, so the big picture way of thinking of it is cosmetics have to be safe, but they don't have to be effective. So FDA is not regulating how nicely the perfume smells. And I don't think it's really qualified to do that. But in terms of the regulation that FDA has done prior to the statute passing, it is very lightly regulated and it's kind of under-resourced. So I'll give some examples. First, just kind of a number. FDA does over 20,000 inspections a year. Those inspections FDA does itself, and that it contracts with states to do. Most of those are food, but there's a lot of drugs and other medical products. Only about 100 of those 20,000 are cosmetics. This is using data prior to COVID when inspections were interrupted. And there are 0 foreign inspections. And a lot of cosmetics are imported. And that's a really small number. So there's kind of a resource question. And the other was prior to this law passing, the powers that FDA had. So comparing it to even over-the-counter drugs, a very important part of drug regulation is what are called good manufacturing practices. And the whole theory behind GMPs, as they're called, is that FDA is not going to just step in once a drug is, to use the lingo, adulterated. In other words, once a drug would have a contaminant in it or something like that. It's going to come up with a whole bunch of procedures by regulation that companies have to comply with. And those procedures involve overseeing your supply chain, how you conduct tests, how you record your data, what equipment you use, how you qualify your equipment, what changes you can make in your processes. And all that are written down in SOPs. And then FDA will come and inspect, and they will issue warning letters or take action against companies, not just when their drugs are actually adulterated, but when these procedural requirements are not met.
So SOP is standard operating procedure.
Correct.
So what you are saying is, for drugs, there are all kinds of rules for safety, including a lot of rules about how drugs have to be made. But for cosmetics, that really hasn't been the case. And not only has that not been the case, but there have been very, very few inspections. And I'm particularly struck by your point that there are no overseas inspections of cosmetic manufacturers at all, given how many cosmetics, presumably quite a lot, that are made in other countries.
That's right. There are very few inspections. And part of it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Because FDA didn't have much regulatory authority and couldn't police GMPs, it'd be very hard for it to take action when there is an issue with cosmetic. They'd have to wait for the product to be adulterated.
So it's sort of like, why do an inspection at all at that point?
Right. It just wouldn't be effective.
But now we have a new law. And before you tell me about that new law, what was so wrong with this pretty light touch approach to cosmetics? Why did Congress step in with a new approach?
Well, I mean, cosmetics are not the highest risk product that FDA regulates. This is not an injectable cancer drug or something like that. But they also are not zero risk. So cosmetics, just to pick an example, take mascara. It's applied near the eyes. If there were bacteria in it that could be harmful to someone's eyes, that could create a serious public health issue. There can be allergens that are in cosmetics. There can be heavy metals in cosmetics. People apply cosmetics when they're open wounds, and they can enter the body. So there are public health risks, and there are occasionally recalls of cosmetics because of issues like pathogens or allergens or some of these things. So Congress looked at this, and I should say FDA has been in favor of this for quite some time and thought it would be good to have the type of regulation we have for drugs, but obviously scaled back. You're not going to introduce an effectiveness requirement for cosmetics, and you're not going to make GMPs like they are for drugs, but something that would allow FDA to police the prophylactic measures that would ensure that there isn't a problem and try to prevent that problem before it occurs.
So let's talk about this new legislation, many years in the making, that would impose some new safety requirements on cosmetics. What's included in this legislation?
So first, as I mentioned before, is the good manufacturing practices. And FDA will have to write those regulations and consult with consumer groups and industry and the like to make sure the regulation fits the products.
So wait, let me just make sure I understand, Howard. Before, companies making cosmetics didn't really have any rules to govern how they made them, but now they will.
They just had to make products that were not adulterated, but there were no manufacturing practice requirements. And now they will. Another very important requirement that's being introduced is what FDA calls adverse event reporting. And adverse event reporting exists for drugs and for other medical products. And that basically is a complaint. So somebody gets a rash, somebody gets sick. They communicate to the company that I use your cosmetic and I developed the following problem. The company, under these new requirements, will have to report that to FDA if it meets a certain threshold. And that's incredibly important because FDA can use that information to monitor potential safety issues and do things like request a recall, things like that. The law also gave FDA a lot of inspection and enforcement authority, and ironically, more than it has for drugs. It allows FDA to have mandatory recall authority. So they can ask a company to recall, but then if there is a very serious issue that could cause a serious health condition, FDA can require a recall. Ironically, it cannot require one for drugs. It's the only big commodity for which that's not true. The law requires cosmetic manufacturers to register with FDA and gives FDA the authority to suspend that registration. So what is suspension of registration? That means if there is a serious compliance issue, FDA can pull the registration, meaning the company could not sell its products. This is an authority FDA got in the Food Safety Modernization Act for food, but one it does not have for drugs. Again, ironically, but a useful tool, one that FDA probably wouldn't have to use very much, but it's a very useful one to have in your toolbox.
So it sounds like big picture, cosmetics regulation is being modernized. It's being brought into the 21st century with requirements that exist for a lot of other products with the goal of having safer cosmetics. Sounds like it's a lot more responsibility for the FDA. Does the new legislation provide any additional resources?
It does. It appropriates about $160 million over 5 years. And that's incredibly important because that will allow FDA to have the resources to conduct more inspections. Without the money, what it would mean would be that if FDA were to do more cosmetic inspections, it would have to basically reduce inspections in areas like food. And you don't want to create the situation of, one commodity competing with the other.
Got it. So it's a new day for cosmetics in the United States of America.
Very much. And I think it's a very good thing for consumers.
Thanks so much for joining us to talk about it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.